Hi everyone, this is my new video about what everyone must know about strategy, and today I'm talking about weak squares. We discussed about closed and open pawn structures already, but now actually to make the best out of your pawn structure, you have to understand the concept of weak squares. So what is a weak square? It is a square that cannot be defended by a pawn. Or more generally, a weak square is a square controlled by your opponent and on which you have very little chance of regaining control. This is the typical example of a weak square. It's taken from a Sicilian pawn structure, and here the d5 square is a weak square for black. And it's a problem because this square can no longer be defended by another pawn because the c pawn has been exchanged and the e pawn has been advanced for black. Which means that, for instance, in this position, white can get a significant advantage by moving the knight to d5. Here it cannot be attacked by a black pawn, and also it cannot be attacked by the bishop because it's a dark squared bishop. In this other position, however, if you play knight to d5, black would immediately reply with knight takes e4, so knight takes d5 is not a threat at the moment. But this move will remain possible for white forever, and black has always to be careful not allowing it, else white will be better. As we have seen, the main issue with weak squares is that they can easily be used by an opponent to establish an outpost. These outposts are usually knights, but can also be bishops or other pieces. We are now going to study a famous example of outpost and weak square. It's taken from a game played by Botvinnik, a former world champion. And here it's a game played in 1936 between Botvinnik and Floor, and it's white's turn to play. There is definitely a weak square here in black's pawn structure. Can you find it? Obviously, that weak square is d6. And it is very weak actually, because it cannot be protected by a pawn anymore. The only black minor pieces that can protect it is the bishop. As you remember, weak squares can be used by the opponent to occupy it with a piece. As white, which piece would you like to put on d6? Of course, you would like to put the knight on d6. And the knight is usually the best piece to occupy a weak square. Now take a seat and enjoy the way Botvinnik played the next few moves with a single goal in mind: put the knight on d6. c5. This first move is very important. It controls d6 one more time, and it also leaves the way to the knight. c5 also creates actually a weak square here for white on d5, but the point here is that black cannot occupy it with a minor piece like a knight or a bishop, so this is not that big a problem. Black plays a5, and now the knight starts moving. Knight to b1, queen f8, knight to a3, bishop d8, knight to c4, bishop c7, and finally knight to d6. White now has an incredibly powerful knight on d6. And there are several remarkable things in that position. The four moves of the knight to reach d6. You have probably watched my previous video about pawn structures. If not, you should watch it now. And this knight march can only work because the pawn structure is closed. If we had the same maneuver in an open position, moving the knight 4 times would probably be too slow and black would have the time to counterattack. This strategy works here because black cannot really create any counter chance because the position is closed. And also, white had to move the pawn to c5 to clear the route for the knight through c4. Now black can probably not afford to capture on d6 because here it would create a very powerful passed pawn. So the consequence is that this knight will remain on d6 for a long time, controlling a lot of important squares and help a lot white's play. And as you expect, white finally won this game. Now, some quizzes. Try to identify weak squares for black in this position. We are going to limit ourselves to the 4 rows in the center of the board. Rows 3, 4, 5, 6. And there is one weak square, it's d6. White could try to occupy it with a knight. An interesting idea would be to push the pawn on c5 to support a minor piece on d6, but at the same time it would create a weak square on d5. So such a possibility has to be carefully balanced. Same question here, what are the weak squares here for black and for white? And d5, as we've seen, is a weak square for black. There is no weak square for white here. And actually d6 is another weak square for black because it cannot be controlled by another pawn as well. Last position, identify the weak squares for black and for white. This time there are more weak squares. d6 for black and d4 and d3 for white. d4 is an obvious weak square for white, but d6 is weak for black. d3 is also weak, but maybe less likely to be attacked by black. Time for the conclusion now. Weak squares are a very important point to consider in a position. Do I have weak squares in my position? Can my opponent occupy them? Are there weak squares in my opponent's position? Can I take advantage of them? And also, whenever you're thinking about a pawn exchange or a pawn move, always think about the consequences in terms of weak squares. Is that pawn exchange or pawn advance going to create a weak square on my side or on my opponent's side? This can be very important for the rest of the game. I hope you enjoyed this lesson about this very important topic, actually, weak squares. In the next video, we'll discuss about the security of your king, keeping your king safe, especially through the castle pawns. Thanks for watching, put a blue thumb if you enjoyed that video. See you next time, bye bye!